Welcome, Albert. It's always a pleasure chatting. What we want to do is start off 2 minutes. We've done this before. Give me a 2-minute kind of when you were from developer, operator, to now investor on the other side of the table. Give the audience, in your words, a little background.
I was born. No.
That's good. What happened next?
I fell in love with computers very early, 35 years ago. In my office, I have the Apple II, on which I learned how to program. And it had a whooping 48 kilobytes of RAM, which was amazing at the time. And I fell in love with that. And then I went off and studied a bunch of computer science and a bunch of economics. And I was at MIT, and I was working on a dissertation, actually. And I had this sudden realization, this was in 95, that probably only 3 people in the world were going to read this dissertation, my 3 thesis advisors, and that was slightly questionable even. So in the meantime, this thing, the web, was happening. I was like, wait a second, I should be doing this. And so I wound up starting a company with 2 MIT professors at the end of 96, early 97. Made just about every mistake imaginable, got adventure funded, brought in a team that knew what they were doing. It was sort of going great. And I was like, this is fantastic. I love this startup thing, but I'm a terrible operator. So what can I do when I'm a terrible operator and I love startups? I'm like, I should be a VC. So from there, it took me essentially another decade to actually become one, and some very circuitous routes.
So you actually had the idea, Albert. Okay, this is not working out, but I got to figure out how can I then get onto the other side. It took 10 years.
Yeah, it took 10 years, and some false starts that I won't bore you with. And then I've been a partner at Union Square Ventures now for a decade.
Fantastic. So let's talk a little bit about the present thesis, because both of our funds are thesis-driven. Obviously, both different stages and different theses. You guys are quite a bit larger and been around for longer than LDV, but it's still thesis, which is interesting. And so tell the audience, in your words, the thesis now, because it's better coming from you than in my words.
Well, I would say at the moment it's unfortunately not as singular and cohesive a thesis as we've had in the past. So if you go back 5 years or so, right, we were really just maniacally focused on finding network effects businesses. Mm-hmm. So I think earlier than some other VC firms, we kind of realized that what the internet age was all about was, as you built at scale, instead of driving down unit cost, which is economies of scale, as you were building out scale in the internet age, what you were trying to do was deliver more value to all of your customers, including your existing customers. And that's very obvious in a social network. So we were early investors in Twitter. As more people join Twitter, the value of Twitter goes up for everybody who's already on Twitter. We then started looking for those types of network effects in other settings as well. Other VC firms all learned the same thing, and today, if anything looks like it has a network effect, people are all over it. So now it's gotten more difficult to figure out what to invest in. So our thesis at the moment says we look for network effects in less obvious places. One of those places is something we'll talk a lot about, which is machine learning, and there the network effect usually is around data. So as you get more data, the results you can achieve get better. As your results get better, you get new customers, which give you more data. Using Clarify as an example, Clarify does image recognition for a number of marketplaces where people list products, and they don't want people to list guns, for instance. And the more images of guns that Clarify sees, the better it gets, and the better it gets for everybody who's a customer of Clarify's. So that's become one part of our thesis. And then we have some other parts. We really believe in access to the internet, and the big companies like Verizon and Time Warner have kind of taken the eye off the ball, and they're buying content companies. And I live on 22nd Street, literally around the corner from here, and I have exactly one broadband provider, and that's Spectrum, the former Time Warner. And to call it broadband is being completely overly generous. So we've done some work in that area. Then we have another thesis around what we call enablers of the new economy, and again, Clarify falls into that. So we've made investments in companies like Twilio, like Clarify, like Shippo, like Cloudflare, that give you services that any business operating on the internet needs. And then the last bit, and one where I actually spent the morning at something called Token Summit, is we've been doing a lot around crypto tokens and the re-decentralization of the internet.
So it's definitely much broader than it has been in the past. But why did you transition, as you mentioned, from the very focused to more broader? Your comment was that other VCs then were seeing that value. And is it a differentiation to be more cutting or bleeding or at a different space or looking at other places where people are not? Or is it just we've seen a lot and now there's more unique opportunities elsewhere?
Well, I think if you want to generate investment returns, you have to go where others aren't.
Right.
I mean, if you want to generate investment returns above the sort of average return, and the limited partners who give us money are not looking to get average returns.
Right. Okay, so let's talk about that computer vision. It's a visual tech summit, as you know, and we've had Andy, your partner in the past, speak here. We've had Joanne Wilson, Fred's wife, and yesterday Josh Kaufman talking about different trends in visual technology. So Clarify is one that we're both investors in. But when you look at computer vision and machine learning, which sector really jumps out at you as, wow, it's going to be disrupted in the future, and we can't even fathom that disruption because of these new technologies?
Well, let me take a step back maybe and bring it back to this Apple II that I had 35 years ago. One of the things I did all the way back then is I immediately got excited about artificial intelligence, and I bought some AI books, which I have thankfully kept. And it's a really interesting time capsule to look at those books. These are books like Winston and Horn, for those who are old enough to remember what that book is. And they all look like toy examples to us now. One of the things that at the time they thought was basically theoretically possible, but nobody knew how to do it, was to do visual recognition. And in fact, Amazon had something called a Mechanical Turk. Mm-hmm. The reference Mechanical Turk is a fun reference to an early automaton, a device from the 1700s that pretended to be playing chess but really had a person inside. And in fact, Mechanical Turk's tagline is artificial intelligence, which I think is pretty funny. And what it was is Amazon had this need, for instance, to categorize products. And they were like, well, computers still suck at this, so how are we going to get these products categorized? And the answer was humans. And so the reason I think vision is so interesting is because vision is something that we as humans do incredibly well, almost effortlessly, and that we really had trouble to get computers to do for the longest time. And so to the extent that we want to think about what are the interesting applications of artificial intelligence, well, it is things that traditionally humans did. And it is things that humans cannot do because there's too much data. Mm-hmm. So bringing these two ideas together, coming back to these marketplaces like OfferUp and so forth, yes, you could use humans to try and detect guns when somebody's trying to list a gun. But if you're getting, at peak rate, 100,000 images in a few minutes, you'd have to have a lot of humans on standby to do this. So the fact that we can now use a machine to do this task is very, very powerful because it means we can actually look at every image that comes through this. And in fact, it's not just for the negative case of excluding guns. It's also, I want to take a picture of an object. I want to list that object. I don't want to have to manually type in the tags for it's a pair of skis. I just want to take the picture, and the listing is going to say skis.
Right. But in regarding to that, so let's say commerce, right? So Alexa, Amazon Echo Look just came out with a validation of my Internet Advise kind of pitch about a year ago that all inanimate objects will have cameras. And so that look comes out and it's going to photograph us and or track us, our style, and hopefully, because I hate shopping, hopefully help me shop so that it just does it automatically. Whether or not
that would be a total breakthrough application for me also. Yeah.
Okay, so at least we're at least we're in that camp, and I figured there's different groups of that, but I would love that. I should know.
By the way, just looking at you and me, I think I need it a lot more than
no,
you.
Different styles. I mean, I wish I was wearing my red pants, my favorite pants, and it should know there's a hole in that. Oh, even better, when's the last pair of those red pants before they get sold out and I can't buy the ones that I love again? Tell me that I can buy the last two and I'll one click and shop. because it should know that mine are wearing out and that there's one available. But going into commerce, so I don't think we've seen how computer vision and machine learning can really help commerce. It's still a search. Why, what about opportunities where cameras are proactively searching? Or our keynote this morning, when you were at the token conferences, there's a war on cameras. So Google just announced AR's Lens, which actually is their visual search for the future. Amazon's Look is their e-commerce, which I think they're going to replace search. So what other sectors do you think will get disrupted that have not been commoditized already?
Yeah, I mean, one area that we're very excited about is healthcare.
Right.
So, of course, a lot of healthcare involves some form of visual inspection. I have a lot of moles, so I need to go to the dermatologist once or twice a year. My dermatologist is really getting up there in age, and I'm always like, does he really still see these things? So he's really nice and really fantastic doctor, but that is a legitimate concern, and it's one of those areas where a machine's not going to be distracted. A machine is going to be very thorough. And then, of course, there's a lot of stuff in pathology. There's radiology images. A lot of healthcare involves the analysis of images. I think that's a very important application area.
You're in figure one, right? Is kind of leveraging images.
Yeah, so far not leveraging machine learning. It's
Not
just
yet,
a community of people in the healthcare field sharing interesting images. But a good example of an early application there would be the same thing. Somebody shares an image to the network. The machine says, this seems to be a radiology image, and then people who are interested in radiology images can see only radiology images as opposed to seeing also, let's say, wound images.
And so we've talked a bunch about kind of the robots as well in the past, which if they don't have vision, they can't do what they're doing. I mean, whether or not it's an autonomous car. We had a lot of sessions yesterday and today about that. Have you guys looked into that space, and is there any kind of, is it too early? Is it too hyped? Is it certain aspects not fitting the thesis?
Yeah, so
what are your thoughts on that space?
So one of our concerns is that, we've been at this for over a decade, and we've put a lot of money to work over time, but we've kept our fund size pretty small in the world of things. I mean, SoftBank just raised a $100 billion fund, so our fund's $175 million. It's a totally different scale. So one of the things we tend to be concerned about is how capital efficient you can be in a particular sector. And the autonomous vehicle sector, it's very hard to see how somebody is going to actually build fundamentally new vehicles, especially for common road usage. I think the only company that has a shot at pulling off a new car company is Tesla. Everything else is more or less an incumbent car company. And then there aren't that many incumbent car companies in the world. So if you're going to be selling your system via one of these incumbent companies, it's a very small market. That leaves people who are working on mobility in on a closed campus where you might have electric vehicles and where building a new vehicle platform isn't so expensive. But our view is that while it's a very large opportunity for sort of humanity to have your car be either entirely self-driving, which personally I think is going to take longer than people think, but there's a lot of really good stuff you can do in the meantime, like your car braking if you're about to run into somebody without you having to do it. That seems like a very near-term, immediate thing. Your car staying in the lane when you're on the highway and all those kind of things. So while it feels very important to us, it doesn't feel like it's a great fit for us to invest in it.
Okay. So let's switch a little bit to, there's a lot of entrepreneurs in the audience at different stages of building companies. One of the biggest questions I think we all get, but it's also good to give kind of tactical advice. How do you go from your first interaction with somebody to deciding to invest? And kind of a period of time, and what are the signals that you like that resonate? Sometimes there's no product, sometimes there is a product, but in general, I'm sure you have a kind of profile that kind of is a process towards interesting to check.
Yeah, so we rarely invest pre-product, and when we do, we suck. Our pre-product track record is frankly abysmal. And we still keep doing it occasionally. I'm not sure why, but so we tend to do well when there is a product that we can look at, and when there are some early metrics of how that product gets used. The other thing I would say is I think it's much easier to invest when you've had multiple interactions over some time period. So when you meet somebody who is not currently racing and they say, look, we'll be racing in the fall, and here's kind of where we currently are. Here's what we think we're going to ship next, and here's some of our metrics. And then you meet them again in the fall. It's 3, 5, 6 months later, and they've kind of done the thing they said they were going to do, and their metrics have developed roughly in the direction they said. That makes it a lot easier. And then for us, of course, it's super important that it actually fits with one of our investment theses.
Right.
So we're not at all deal flow driven. Of the deals we've done, very little is stuff that sort of randomly came over the transom. Most of it are things where we wrote a blog post or we wound up speaking saying, hey, we think this thing is interesting. So for instance, recently we've gotten very interested in the intersection of genetics and machine learning, because it seems like the data sets and the complexity, the dimensionality of the space is such that it's very hard for humans to make sense of this data, but machines can. So we've written a blog post about it, and now people who are sort of working at that are coming to us.
So it's interesting you're saying that. You don't take things over the transom, but you actually are. But it's driven from a blog post or a speaking event. So it's actually
we put out flypaper. It's
So it is okay. So it's over the transom going to that flypaper, right? So because does it change if somebody that introduces? I mean, obviously, if somebody's saying,
no,
hey,
we're not very sort of like, oh, it's so and so who introduced this. It must be good.
Okay, because a lot of people are.
Yeah, no, not us.
And you guys write a lot of blogs, and there's a lot of kind of getting it out there. With when you say out of 100%, what percentage is I like this, I want to see what's out there, or this? Is it the goal to get the flies to stick?
Yeah, I mean.
I'm sorry for the metaphor. We continue
No,
going.
It's you're not all flies.
You're very beautiful flies.
So it is our goal to, as much as possible, not be reactive, but sort of have a process that's, where we form an idea, a thesis, then we meet with startups, and then we kind of go, oh, we were slightly wrong here, we got to revise this a little bit. Then we meet with more startups, we're like, oh, there's an even better way to think about this. And so as this progresses, I think it's great for both sides because they learn how we're thinking about the problem. And sometimes they go, those guys are completely out to lunch and they don't know what they're talking about. And sometimes they go, oh, that's actually an interesting insight, and vice versa. Right. And so over time, that gets better. And over time, normally then we also make one investment and a second investment, and then the thesis gets improved through that. And so the point of having a thesis is so that you have a way of taking the signal that you're getting from meeting with people and updating something. I think if you don't have an explicit thesis, then all you have is signal. It's all noise because you don't have anything to compare it to. And science doesn't progress by people throwing random stuff around and just measuring data. It's because they have a hypothesis, then they run an experiment, then they compare the data to the hypothesis. And I'm not trying to suggest that our investing is scientific, but it's at least trying to use the same mechanism.
I fully agree. Obviously, I mean, you probably, as you know, I do similar things about putting these blog posts out there or write on TechCrunch or Next Web, the Internet of Eyes, a year in advance. And hey, which companies are relating to that? They come in. We also use this summit to do the same thing.
Yeah.
Bringing companies here to speak before I even understand really the sector, and then get the audience talking about it. We had a couple here in medical imaging. Yesterday was a presentation on an affordable, portable MRI out of Harvard. Today was Recursion Pharmaceuticals and Path AI analyzing different, leveraging machine learning and computer vision to analyze cells and help with drug treatments. And like you, interested in that space, I am as well, but I'm not an expert. Looking for the experts actually to look at companies together and surface them that way.
Yeah. And I think those areas are, as I said before, super exciting.
I agree. Okay, so on that note, understanding how you're processing and looking for the deals and kind of creating the signals, let's talk a little bit about, we're both operators that have gone to the other side. So what are the things that you said you weren't a good operator?
Definitely not.
What are the things that you learned from your mistakes that help the people you invest in to avoid those mistakes?
Well,
and how do you do it is the hardest part.
Yeah, because I realized I wasn't a very good operator, it meant I had some time to go figure out what it meant to be a good investor. And I think one of the first things to recognize as the investor is that you're the investor, not the operator. And so that means that it's not your company. You can't go in there and say you have to do X. If you have concluded somehow that doing X, raising prices, replacing the VP of marketing, whatever it may be, if you've concluded that's the right thing to do, now you have to, as an investor, think, okay, how do I get this idea to be the entrepreneur's idea, and where they go, oh, yeah, that's my idea. It's my idea to replace the VP of marketing, because that's the only way it'll work. So I had to learn how to do that, and every entrepreneur is a different person, and so how you interact with them has to be different. And so learning about how to build trust with somebody so that when the moment comes where you're trying to suggest something to them that they might want to resist, that you can actually pull on a reservoir of trust. That's incredibly important. I think the single biggest impact that you can have as an investor, and it's extraordinarily hard, is if you can help an entrepreneur understand what his or her weaknesses are. Because nobody is perfect. Nobody knows how to do everything. And every company winds up reflecting the strengths and weaknesses of the founding team. And the more cognizant you can help make the founding team be of what those are, the easier it gets for them to sort of steer against it. So, I don't want to name names, but one of the entrepreneurs I've been working with for quite some time is just a very sort of caring person, and as a result, sometimes finds it hard to be demanding. And so sometimes there wasn't enough accountability in the company. And so if you can help that kind of entrepreneur recognize that, hey, you need somebody who's maybe a little less caring than you are, but who can drive the accountability dimension in the organization, then you can have a huge impact. Because if that comes together in the right way, now the team is actually much, much stronger than it was before. But that's a long and hard process.
So it seems more of a coaching process, and also then a doing process, which I had a lot of trouble going from an entrepreneur to an investor because I wanted to roll up my sleeves instantly.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's the wrong thing to do.
Yeah,
and
no.
Josh and I talked about that yesterday. All three of us coming from that, and that's the hardest. That was my hardest transition.
It wasn't hard for me because I wasn't a good operator. So.
Well, good or bad, I'm not perfect either. But just the desire to do that is challenging to avoid. So. Let us, it's easy to talk about the positive things. What about a negative thing? Tell us a mistake post-investment that you made with either a board or a company or one of those coaching, and what happened without naming names? Because nothing's perfect and we're constantly learning. Give us an example of a learning process through a mistake.
Yeah, I once told an entrepreneur that the company was succeeding despite him instead of because of him. I think that turned out to be a little too direct, and it was not very well received.
Yeah, that's less of a coach and more of something else.
Yeah, I learned to become
was that an
much
early
more
issue?
subtle. Yeah, that's a long time ago.
And how did that company do?
The company went public. Not with that entrepreneur though.
Oh, okay.
So
what was the time period where that entrepreneur was no longer there and it went public?
The company went public quite a time after the entrepreneur was there. So now we can all go through our portfolio and go figure it out.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Clarify, which we invested very early. His professor spoke at our first summit here 4 years ago, and Matthew spoke a couple years ago. We don't rotate speaker. We don't have same speakers, so nobody can speak again. You talked a little bit about the computer vision and tagging images and that big opportunity as it's growing. And now, earlier panel talked about some computer vision becoming commodity. I mean, how do you look at the computer vision space and maybe Clarify as it's going up against Google and Amazon and IBM? How do you look at that as defending against the commoditization of any tech, but this case, computer vision?
Well, I think there are two really important components here. The first is, I think it would be a very bad world in which the only providers of machine intelligence at scale are Amazon and Google. Mm-hmm. both of these are companies with insatiable appetites, and they can and will use the training data to their own advantage. If you think about the history of Google, Google was indexing the web, and then they were indexing Yelp pages, and then they rolled out their own local search. And so if you're in any business and you go, do I want to send my images to Google? Do I want to send my images to Amazon? I think you need to ask yourself repeatedly, like, do I really believe that they're not eventually going to compete with me? And I think it's really extremely important for the world to have multiple independent companies that aren't trying to compete with everybody in the world, that can provide you with the same level of intelligence that a Google and an Amazon can. We call this the unbundling of scale. The idea being, Amazon, for instance, has a massive advantage because of the extraordinary scale with fraud detection. Mm-hmm. And it's really easy to be on the internet and not have any fraud. You just don't sell anything. The trick is, how do you sell a lot and have very little fraud? Mm-hmm. And so we invested in a company called Sift Science that takes the data from all its customers, pools it, and then does machine learning for fraud detection across all the pooled data. And the goal is to give anybody, even if they're tiny, the same level of fraud detection that Amazon has. If you are an e-tailer, you're not going to use Amazon for your fraud detection, right, because you're not going to send all your transaction data to Amazon. And I think the same is going to be true in the visual space. We badly, badly need independent companies. So I think one way that Clarify will be differentiated is simply by virtue of it is an independent company that's there to empower others and not compete with them. And then the second question about commoditization is, I actually don't think it's readily commoditizable. So I think people are very mistaken that they think they can just download TensorFlow, throw a bunch of images at it, and get good image recognition. It's just, it's one of these curves where it's very easy to get to 80%, and then extremely hard to get the rest done. And so people are going, oh, look, I just did this in one afternoon, and it's performing great. And then you sort of realize that it just does really, really poorly on the remaining 20%. And if you're trying to deliver a world-class customer experience, it's not the first 80% that matters. It's like the last 5% that matters. And so this is why I think this is a problem that only a few companies can tackle, that really need to develop scale, that need to process millions, billions of images in every realm so that you can get to all the edge cases and do well on 98%, 99%, 99.9% of the images.
And I happen to agree, but the challenge is what has been brought up in other sessions, just for the audience to have a perspective, is that computer vision, that the baseline. I look at it as 70% of or 80% of facial recognition has been commoditized, but the hardest part is still that next 10%, and or the latest 5% or 4%. And so when you look at Clarify in doing that, there are so many edge cases. Wouldn't you agree that in so many different sectors that have the problem? There's not going to be a business in every sector doing that classification. So the goal is more of a platform, which ties into the thesis of Unit Square.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So the other thing I would add is that you're going to want your models in lots of different places. So a lot of recognition is not going to happen back in the cloud. A lot of recognition is going to happen on device. And so you're going to need to figure out how to train models and then ship them to the device, update them locally, take some of the local learning, bring it back. So there's a rather large just administrative overhead. And I think when people sort of think of it as just spin up TensorFlow and train a model, they're not thinking about how does this model get maintained, how does this model get shipped out and executed on device, and so forth. The complexity of that goes up very rapidly. And for most companies, if you're Pinterest, you have the scale to do this yourself. But for most companies, they're not going to want to figure out how to do all this stuff themselves. They're going to want to figure out how to create the best user experience around this. And so what it does mean, though, for companies like Clarify is they can't charge based on value. They have to drive down their own cost. They have to be a leader at execution. And people have to look at it and go, yeah, sure, I could maybe shave off 5% if I did this myself, but it's not worth it.
Got it. So we're going to have questions in a minute or so start thinking, and our interns with the mics will get ready. Let's bring up on that, talking about economies of scale and kind of that kind of the money issue transition into your book, World After Capital. Tell this audience why?
Yeah, so the fundamental premise of the book is that as humanity, we've had sort of three big ages. The forager age, the agrarian age, the industrial age, and that we are still in a way stuck in the industrial age, and that digital technologies give us the opportunity to get out of the industrial age into what hopefully will be the knowledge age. I think people keep calling the information age, but information is like spewing forth from all these systems. We have no shortage of information. What we have is a shortage of knowledge. And so the book talks about, first of all, this large historical arc and how it's sort of played itself out. And then it also talks about what the kind of things are that we could do to get from the industrial age to the knowledge age. And in particular, I talk about three freedoms. Economic freedom, which is some form of universal basic income or basic income guarantee. Informational freedom, which has to do with how do we get more information and more computation in the hands of lots of people instead of bulking it up inside of Google and Facebook. We just talked about that a little bit. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's this strange thing where we all carry a supercomputer in our pocket. You've paid for the supercomputer, you pay for the power to charge it, you pay for the data plan to connect to the internet, and then when you hit the app icon of any app, you've lost complete control over what the supercomputer does. It does nothing on your behalf. It acts on behalf of the company whose app you've downloaded. That's a weird situation that I think we need to fix. And then the last freedom is what I call psychological freedom, which is our brains didn't evolve in a world that was full of bazillion cat videos, right? When you saw a cat, it was an actual cat and it meant something, right? And so now you could sit there all day and refresh your Twitter feed.
All those cats mean something to somebody.
Well, yeah, but the question is, do they all need to mean something to you?
Yeah, they don't to me, but I get your point. And so, how does that that thesis of that evolution of the book impact the venture capital industry?
Yeah. So.
And your job.
So. The reason it's called World After Capital is because capital was the binding constraint in the industrial age. Attention is the binding constraint in the knowledge age.
Absolutely.
And so a lot of our investing is aimed at how do we help with this transition in some form or another. And so
contextual filtering or filtering and also using computers to process
that definitely,
signal
that's one
to
thing.
The noise.
But also, the first step, economic freedom, is about making things really cheap and accessible. So if you look at our healthcare portfolio or our education portfolio, a lot of the services we've invested in are aimed at making things radically cheaper. So if you look at learning, we have Duolingo, it's free language learning, Codecademy, free learning how to program, Quizlet, free service for your own study cards. If you look at our healthcare portfolio, companies like Neurix, which give you really, really super low-cost access to prescriptions. So that, is one step. And then the other step is what you just said, which is how can we give people a maximum sort of access to the information that they actually are looking for and not distract them with tons of things that really are just that, a distraction.
Right, but so the first group is interesting, though. You said free. Yeah. But obviously you wouldn't invest it if there was not an opportunity somewhere else to make money. So it's a piece of it to the end user might be free, but there's, as you mentioned, when people click on the app, the businesses are going to hopefully make a lot of money elsewhere.
Yeah.
So it's not a free business.
So we believe in having big free tiers on these services and then having some kind of paid tier. Okay. A lot of the services use some form of advertising, but many of them are now rolling out some paid subscription tier. And so the idea is you try to make as much of the product available for free, and then the people who are getting the most value from it, they'll subscribe. And one of the reasons we've kept our fund small is because we don't want the money to be the tail that wags the dog, which is the thing people are trying to build. And so a big fundamentally transformative element of digital technology is that it can deliver services at zero marginal cost. And so if you can deliver something at zero marginal cost, you should try to make the marginal use case be free to the end user. So that's something we're very focused on.
Great. Questions? Raise your hands for questions. We've got a couple minutes left. Who has questions? I have many more, obviously, and I'll continue. And as I was talking to an entrepreneur out in the hallway, they said, how do I get noticed and how can I meet those investors? Can you introduce me? And I said, no, ask the most interesting, thought-provoking question so we know who you are in advance. There we go. I knew it always works. It's amazing.
So you hear this as a recurring argument, the notion of non-commodification of things like machinery, okay? So at some point, for instance, we would assemble a custom processor in a computer until computers became commodified, first through super minis and then through microprocessors. Then you look at the other end of the argument, for instance, in the very large energy concerns who by definition will vertically integrate, analogous to some of the arguments that the Amazons and the Googles of the world are making. So what is to stop this in a sense? When a Rob Fergus or a Matt Zeiler at Clarify optimizes these techniques and makes them available, one of the arguments that you'll hear is that the notion of recognition as a service is falling through the wayside because it is becoming so commodified. So I'm curious as to what the panel's notion of counter-argument is to this. It very much does seem like its end game is to be commodified, no differently than, for instance, RAM was commodified, as perhaps any of our Intel attendees might know, going into the 80s.
Well, first of all, I'm not making the argument that things will not be commodified in the long run. Turns out that people are making huge fortunes on commodities. It's just you have to have your cost structure in order. So it's not like people are making RAM for free and losing money on it. People who make RAM are still making a lot of money. In fact, the people who figured out how to make the world's consumption of RAM has shot through the roof, and so the people who make it make a lot of money. It just means that when you get to that point in the future, you better be the low-cost provider or one of the low-cost providers. But I'm pretty sure that on this particular topic, we are relatively far from that point. Now, relatively far doesn't mean 50 years. This could be a 5 to 10 year thing. But it's not a commodity today. And so, but I think if you are pursuing a premium pricing strategy in this field, I think that would be a mistake.
Great. Next question. Who else? Anybody over there to the right, in the back?
Hi, Brian Marassa with Focal out of Boston. Really love the thesis. It's a great one. But I think in general, VC that I've spoken with have a certain fixation with accuracy requirements as kind of the key metric of the system, right? When we're in the computer vision domain. But having built systems, vision systems for 10 years, I think the white elephant in the room is that you can't optimize for accuracy without also optimizing for system quality of service and the platform, right? And so you've got these three sets of requirements: accuracy, quality of service, and platform that you have to work against at all times. And they sort of have this pernicious relationship. So, what are your thoughts? How does that particular reality of building and delivering vision systems in practice trickle down onto your thesis?
Well, I'm not sure that I see the same trade-off that you're seeing between the system and accuracy. I think it's a little early for me to comment on where Clarify is, but SIFT, where we've been investors for longer and the company's been around for longer, it's actually been a virtuous loop, which is, SIFT has very high uptime, very fast delivery, and high accuracy, and so it means more customers go, oh, this service really works, so I'm going to be one of their customers, which gives them more data, which lets them increase the accuracy. So we've seen a positive feedback loop between investing in system uptime, speed, all the things you want, and accuracy. We've not seen a conflict between those. So I may be missing the argument, but that's the reality that we've observed.
One last question. Who in the back there on the left? And then I've got a couple to end with. Go ahead. No? Okay, he got shy all of a sudden. Who's next? Anybody else? One more? No? Yes, go.
Going back to the healthcare topic, there's a lot of amazing tech coming out, but the market is rather inefficient when pricing or productivity are not necessarily the driving force, especially in the US. How do you guys look at some of these amazing technologies gaining widespread market adoption?
Yeah, that's a great question. So both in the education realm and in the healthcare realm, the bulk, although not all of our investing, has been in companies that are delivering their service entirely outside of the existing system. Because we think that both of the healthcare system in its current incarnation and the education system in its current incarnation are not the most innovation friendly and will, if anything, overall be late adopters of technology as opposed to early adopters. So we've mostly been focused on opportunities that bypass the system and go directly to the consumer as a way of early adoption. Eventually, in order to succeed at scale, it has to go back inside the system and the system itself has to change. But we don't really have a lot of companies that try to sell to healthcare systems or that try to sell to large school districts. We have some, but it's a subset of what we do.
Great. Anybody else for questions? Okay, we'll come back to me. Or if you have got questions, Albert. I know you said that was harder than answering questions, so I don't want to make you work too hard. But, okay, advice for the entrepreneurs building businesses. What's the one sentence that is the most important advice from you to them?
I think work on something you care about. It's way too hard and way too long to work on something you don't actually care about.
How would you define care?
Something where you wake up in the morning and you're excited to be working on it. Like on the thing itself, not because you think it's going to make money or I am genuinely intrigued by this problem and I want to go solve this problem.
Great. Okay, last question, which I ask everybody that I interview because I think it's actionable and interesting. Every year you meet tons of different entrepreneurs. What is your favorite trait of an entrepreneur and your least favorite trait of an entrepreneur? However, in one word answers. So what's that personality trait that you love and hate?
Being persistent and being persistent.
Okay, Albert, thank you very much. Look forward to doing more deals with you, and I appreciate you coming down.